Hello.
Hello AOS fans!
It's the Agents of Sigmar.
And today we're going to bring you the ultimate beginner's guide to Warhammer Underworlds.
So what is Underworlds?
Well Pete, I would say it's a quick to play arena combat miniatures board game with cards.
So it's a little bit like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering smashed together with Lord of the Rings and chess.
Yep, so you've got some models, you've got some cards,
You've got some boards.
and you play a game.
And unlike a lot of Games Workshop games, rather than having dozens or possibly even hundreds of models to have to paint and keep your eye on, in this version you've only got maybe 3 to 9 models.
Absolutely, you only have a single warband that you look after, and you basically can play it on a small tabletop area. You don't need a great big 6x4 board. You can literally play this in a 3x3 area, and the board itself is much smaller than that.
Along with it not taking up a lot of space, not needing a lot of models and not having to paint those models, games of Underworlds can be played really quickly.
Really quickly.
Really quickly.
For Age of Sigmar or Warhammer 40,000, you're looking at least a couple of hours for a game, a single game.
Minimum.
Yeah, but you can crash out a game of Warhammer Underworlds in under an hour easily, probably in under 45 minutes, really.
Yeah.
And when you get really good, you can smash out 3 games in 90 minutes.
Another good thing about Underworlds is that all the models can be easily push fit together. You don't need any glue, you just need a pair of clippers to clip them off the sprue and they all push together nicely.
And they're all different, lovely different colour plastics as well.
Yes.
I think they are for every single warband. There's a slightly different colour plastic.
So where's the best place to start?
Well, first thing I would say is to forget any preconceived ideas you have of Warhammer, because it is pretty much, although it's got the Warhammer name attached to it, it is pretty much entirely in its own universe. You don't have to worry about anything else that's going on anywhere else in the Warhammer or Warhammer 40,000 franchises. Games Workshop deliver us a core box every 6 months.
It used to be every 12 months, but they changed things up a few years ago.
Yeah, so you may hear people talking about old seasons, which we'll come on to in a minute. And just to make things a little bit more confusing, there's also a starter box too. So what's the difference between the two, Pete?
Well, a starter box tends to come out about every 2 years and features a couple of warbands that you may or may not have seen before, unlike the core boxes which come out every 6 months and always have something new in.
Now, a starter box seems like it would be a really good place to start.
It can be. If you're brand new to the game, it's probably the best place to begin because it's cheaper than the core boxes and you get everything you need to play, including in the most recent version, a little how to play guide, which literally walks you through every step of the game and dice roll. The only drawback really to the starter box is that it's missing a few rules. So if you do want to expand things and start to play other people and maybe go to tournaments or pick up other warbands, you are going to have to buy one of the core boxes as well.
Yes, one of the major differences is that there's no magic rules in the starter box. They don't change the game very much, but they do change it enough to mean that you'll be missing out on that experience if you do only buy a starter box. However, I do think the current starter box featuring the Sepulchral Guard and the Fast Riders is probably one of the absolute best places to jump into Underworlds. But that's not to say you can't get a core box to jump into Underworlds.
In the core boxes themselves, you get everything you need. You'll get the warbands like you do in the starter box, you'll get the board, you'll get all the tokens, you'll get the dice, you'll even get the magic dice in this version too. Along with those 2 warbands, you'll also get 2 other rivals decks. We'll come on to rivals decks in a little while, but with all of that, you have enough there to be able to play loads of games.
Absolutely. So to recap, you get the miniatures for 2 different warbands, you get the cards that go with those miniatures for 2 different warbands, and you get 2 extra decks to mix things up, change things up in your game, which you don't get in the starter set. So that is an additional thing that you do get, and you can do what's called deck building, which you can't do with the starter set.
One downside to the core boxes versus the starter boxes is price. It is a bit more expensive, but you do get a lot more in it.
I do tend to think it's better value actually, because you do get everything and you don't ever need to buy another box again. Whereas if you buy the starter box, you will have to buy a core box if you want to take your game beyond the dining room table. I think one of the reasons for not jumping straight into a core box could be that sometimes the warbands that you get in those core boxes can have quite complicated rules mechanics. So we do get some quite quirky and unusual things which you wouldn't normally expect from like a this is your first experience of this game situation.
Now that's not to say that the warbands that you get in those starter boxes are underpowered or not good. They can be just as good as any of the others, but they tend to be a little bit simpler in the mechanics, and the way it explains it to you during the game is generally a little bit easier to accept. So you might be wondering, if there's been all these core boxes and starter sets that have already come out, do I need to go and buy them all?
Well, you don't, Pete. You can if you want to, although you'll struggle to buy them all, but you don't have to go and buy them all. You can literally go out to the shop tomorrow, buy something and just carry on playing, looking only forwards.
Yep.
And I actually, to a degree, would recommend that as a way of playing. Just because of the way these games work, the rule set has got better, and the warbands themselves have got better and more interesting as time has gone on. But you can go and look for older ones if you want. If there's a particular one you've heard about that piques your curiosity, then you can go and try and find it in a shop. The longer ago it was in the history of Underworlds, the harder it is to find, and you may end up paying extra for it.
Now, if you're a returning player and you bought a box 2 or 3 years ago and you're sitting there going, well, can I use what I've got in here? The answer is yes, you can use the warbands at least. The rules will have updated, and GW do put those online in a PDF free for everybody, so you will have to go and bag another copy of those. Now, not everything in those older boxes is valid, and this is where the whole rotation mechanic that GW use comes into play.
So what this means, over the 7 or so years that Warhammer Underworlds has been in existence, we've now got 50 to 60 warbands that all have cards that go with them, and they are all still valid. If you pick an old one up in a shop, find one in a charity shop or something like that, you can use it, which is a really nice element of the game, I think. And some people pretty much have bought the things they bought 5 or 6 years ago and love it and still play it, and they can take it to a tournament. None of your warbands, none of your miniatures have yet ever rotated out, so they're all still valid.
Only 2 warbands have been superseded by newer versions of them being released in the latest starter box. They effectively replace the old cards, but if you don't have the new starter box, you only have the old ones, and you want to play with a friend, you can still use them, you just can't take them to a tournament.
So you've got your box, you've chosen your warband. What do you do, Pete?
Well, there are, slightly confusingly, 3 different ways to play this game, and they all use exactly the same set of base rules, but the different methods of playing affect what cards you can use. There is the Rivals format, the Nemesis format, and the Relic format.
We're not really going to touch on Relic format in this video because this is a beginner's video, and it's fair to say beginners don't play Relic.
No.
Rivals is the simplest version, and you can play it straight out of the box without doing any tinkering whatsoever.
In fact, it is the most recommended way to start playing the game, whether you've got a starter box or a core box.
Because this game has evolved over a long period of time, and GW have kind of tinkered with different directions, and we've had a pandemic in the middle of it, I would say it grown organically, if I was being kind, which can be a little bit confusing.
Most warbands now come with 32 cards in their deck, and that's their warband deck cards, and you can just take that deck and use that in a game of Rivals. It doesn't matter which season it came from, you can use it, apart from
Seasons 1 and 2.
For some reason, Seasons 1 and 2, GW decided that you didn't need a full deck of cards. They were literally playing without a full deck of cards.
So what this means, if you do want to play a Season 1 or 2 warband in Rivals format, you need to find what's called a Rivals deck.
Now, you get Rivals decks in the core boxes. You get 2 of those and 2 warbands, and you can basically take a warband and take a Rivals deck, and there's your Rivals combination to play with.
Yeah, basically one Rivals deck can be paired with any warband. Now, one Rivals deck might go better with a particular warband than another, but we'll cover that in a future video. In the more modern releases, each Rivals deck and warband deck has a little symbol, so you can really easily see what it is you're using, which is quite nice. One thing it is worth bearing in mind, GW themselves weren't quite sure how they wanted this Rivals format to go until quite late in the day, so some of the earliest seasons that do actually have like officially full 32 cards, they're actually pretty poor as a playing experience, so that's something to be aware of. But I'm afraid, really only experience is going to tell you that, because different people find different things easy and difficult.
So that's the Rivals format, and it is the easiest format of the game to play. The next one on, which is just a little bit more complicated, is the Nemesis format.
Now, in the Nemesis format, you can start doing some deck building.
So if you're familiar with things like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering, this is where you get to stretch your fingers and start to think about those tactical choices and what cards you want to pick.
Unlike those games, however, you can only include one single version of each card in your deck.
And you can only pick from your Warbands cards and one other Rivals deck.
Literally only one. You can't say, well, I like that card from that Rivals deck and I also like that card from this different Rivals deck. You're not allowed to do that. Yep. You can only pick your own Warband faction cards and just from one Rivals deck. This gives each Nemesis deck a sort of flavour of how it works together. So you have something, there's one called the Breakneck Speed, which is sort of all about charging around the table and hitting things over the head. And you have one which is called the Paths of Prophecy, which is all about being a bit more stealthy and jumping on objectives, which again we'll talk about when we talk about the mechanics of the game.
Yep, certain warbands will go a lot better with certain Rivals decks than others, and generally it's something you're going to find out over time as you play the game as to what works well with other things.
Pete and I are of the opinion that Nemesis is the best way to play. It gives you a little bit of control over what you're doing, a little bit of deck building, which is quite nice for that little cerebral challenge, but it never gets out of control. With the Nemesis deck, it's fairly simple, so you've got a little bit of control, you can play how you want to play, but without getting too onerous.
It's not like a CCG. All of the cards come out in predefined decks, so you haven't got to worry about getting those rare card drops or anything like that. Having said that though, generally after a couple of years, GW stopped producing a Rivals deck, and after a couple of years, they're no longer valid in the Nemesis format, and that's called rotation.
So rotation does affect both Rivals and Nemesis formats.
Every 2 years, a deck that's been released falls out of rotation, can no longer be used in competitive matches. If you want to play a game with your mate on a coffee table, that's still allowed. But if you want to go to a tournament, you can only use Rivals decks that came out in the last 2 years.
Absolutely, and I will reiterate, the warbands, they never rotate out. You can always use those. Games Workshop publish a list of what's valid on their website, which they keep updated on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that the boards that you play on do also rotate as well. Again, that's all listed on their website as to which ones are valid and which ones aren't, but it's everything from the last 2 years, effectively.
So that's our introduction to Warhammer Underworlds. It's because it's grown up piecemeal, it is a little bit complicated, but hopefully that's helped you set you straight on the path to playing what we think is comfortably Games Workshop's best game that they make.
Best ever game, yes. And if you do have any questions that we haven't covered, or any of the things we said maybe have triggered other things that you want to find out about, do ask us in the comments below.
Absolutely, and that brings us on to the final thing I want to talk about, which is resources for the game, because there's quite a few excellent resources out there to help you on your Underworld journey.
There are a couple of very strikingly handsome gentlemen called the Agents of Sigmar, and they tend to do a lot of stuff about Underworlds, and they're always worth looking out for.
Absolutely, and they'll pretty much always answer questions on Facebook, or if you email them on their YouTube channel. They will always try and get back to you with help. For official updates and rules changes and FAQs and things, do check out the official Games Workshop pages. I think we'll put all these links in the description below.
Yeah, GW are pretty good at keeping all of that fairly up to date so that you know exactly where you are, especially, as we mentioned earlier, with some of that rotation and what decks are valid.
The 100% absolute best resource for Warhammer Underworlds, better even than the Agents of Sigmar, is the amazing Underworld DB. This is basically a database catalogue of every single card in the game, and you can use it for building decks, or you can just use it for checking card text, or you can just use it to see what other warbands are out there. It's just a 100% brilliant resource.
There are also lots of blogs and posts out there and podcasts that you can find. A few of them are Spent Glory.
Yes, Spent Glory is an excellent blog, particularly aimed at beginners. That's why we've included it in here. It has a whole text version of what we've just been saying.
Yep.
You can always go back and refer to it. It's a really good resource. He also put me onto Battle Mallet,
Yep.
which is another excellent resource, particularly when you're learning about deck building, and it's got a whole list of interesting Rivals combinations and interesting Nemesis decks to play. So if you don't want to kind of a bit worried about doing it yourself, it gives you guidance and advice and help on that. And the other long-running podcast is Path to Glory, helmed by a man who is the World Warhammer champion. So
Yeah.
he knows his stuff.
Maybe a little bit more advanced than...
It's definitely
than
with
your
a
average
competitive
beginner.
edge.
Yes, but it definitely gives you a good key insight into the competitive world of Underworlds.
I'm not sure they're as handsome as us either.
No,
But
maybe.
we'll let you decide. So we hope you found that useful. All these things, we wanted to keep it short and sweet, and as usual with Underworlds, you can't, because there's just so many extra little twiddly bits to add. But do look out for more videos in this series, and do let us know in the comments below if there's anything you'd like.
As always, do like, subscribe and ring the bell so you'll see when we produce more content and new stuff.
Absolutely, and if you want to come and join our community over on Patreon, do consider supporting us that way too. We have a great little Discord going on there. It's a really good way to pick up new tips and things. We have a fairly new player joined in the not too distant past. He loves talking to us about the sort of old warbands and where he might get them and such like, and it's really good to talk to new players.
So we'll see you soon in the Underworlds.